Hello, everyone, and welcome to 2023. It's so exciting to be moving into this new year with you all. And today, on this episode of The Crypto Ethic, we are releasing a conversation that Anya and I recorded with a woman called Margot. And she is someone who has done a lot of interviews in the crypto space, is very interested in Bitcoin and is part of the Bitcoin Policy Institute. And so we really wanted to get her on so that we could have a conversation with her about what she's interested in the space and in Bitcoin in general. And so we had a quite long conversation. So we've included the majority of that conversation, but have had to edit it down a little bit. But we really hope that you enjoy, and we really look forward to speaking with you next week, when it will just be back to me and Anya, but we will have more interviews coming into the future. If you would like to get hold of Margot, we have put her contact details in the show notes. If you want to get hold of us, then you can do that at info@thecryptoethic.com. So I hope that you enjoy. Hi. Hi, Anya. Hi, Margot.
Hi, thank you for having me today.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
So today, as you can see, we have a lovely guest joining us, Margot. She's going to introduce herself to you, and you're going to get to hear some of Margot's really interesting stories and really interesting work that she does. And so we're really, really excited to have her join us here. So Margot, do you want to just very briefly just introduce yourself and just maybe give a little bit of an idea of your work in Bitcoin, if that feels good?
Sure, yeah. I am a fellow at the Bitcoin Policy Institute. We're a relatively young think tank we're based in the cloud, I guess you could say. And the main purpose of the Bitcoin Policy Institute is to have an expert voice, an expert angle on Bitcoin. So all the fellows are academics. They have PhDs or they're PhD candidates like myself, and many of them are professors. We interact with policymakers, and we also try to educate the public on Bitcoin and do research. So I'm on the energy and environmental side of Bitcoin in terms of the research that I do at BPI and the things that I write about. And I've worked there alongside Troy Cross, and he and I have collaborated on a few projects through BPI, including a report that we submitted to the White House. Is their Office of Science and Technology Policy, I believe that's what it's called. And so we have a pretty interesting relationship, I guess you could say, or at least back and forth with one of the people who is in charge of that committee that was studying the impacts of cryptocurrency in general for the White House. So yeah, so that's the kind of stuff we do at BPI, and I enjoy working with them. So part of my job is to let people know that BPI exists. And I am also a PhD candidate at Georgia Tech. I'm in the Civil and Environmental Engineering department, and I'm working on a climate model there, trying to wrap that up as soon as possible. And I started off as a physicist. I still am a physicist, but I'm not in the physics department anymore. And I switched departments because I wanted to work on stuff related to climate change. I thought that was really important, and I wanted to do more about that in my own life. So I really changed my whole career and trajectory and my whole life around to trying to work and solve this climate crisis. And then that sort of became intersected with my interest in Bitcoin. And then so I started writing about that because I saw that there was some important aspects to Bitcoin that I thought were important for addressing these issues around climate change, which when you really start to look deeper into it, you realize that it's not just an issue of carbon emissions. It's actually a much more systemic issue that is related to how our economic system works and how our energy is produced and also what is sustainable under planetary boundaries. So when you start looking at it from this angle, you realize, well, there's this money called Bitcoin, this monetary system, and it flips certain incentives around, and that can actually be beneficial when you're thinking about sustainability. So those are the things that really interest me when it comes to Bitcoin.
I love how you've combined and created this intersection between two important things, and that's sort of the future of climate change on planet Earth, and then the future of Bitcoin, and how can that help us navigate both issues that are, climate change is, it needs more than what we've been giving it, in terms of attention, political attention. It doesn't seem to be working. So this idea that perhaps Bitcoin can help us navigate our relationship with each other, economically, socially. Maybe I'm taking it too far, but your work excites me so much, and the things you've written about, your essays on Medium, and the various interviews you've done, and it's gotten me excited and hopeful. Especially coming from somebody young, and you have your whole future ahead of you, and all these changes that you can make. And give you a big shout out and thank you for all the work that you are doing.
Oh, wow. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate that, because sometimes it's challenging. It's challenging to convince people that there's something useful with Bitcoin at all, let alone with climate change or the sustainability or anything like that. People really they're allergic. They have a very intense reaction to Bitcoin sometimes, but I appreciate that makes me feel a little bit better about those challenges.
Oh, you're doing really important stuff. And
Thank you.
it's a lot of it is time, time for people to get it, to break out of the sort of vision that they're in right now. I'm curious, how do you navigate with with friends and family? Do you try to convince them and share with them all this great knowledge that you have? Or do you sort of wait till they ask you? I mean, it is like that because you are so full of information.
Well, I've never been a very good evangelist, and I've never been good at selling things either. So I tend to not really talk to people about what I do. Also, if I do, I think it's just the people I know, but most people don't really want to hear what I have to say, so they get upset. I can't even talk to most people about climate change in general, because that means that they have to change their behavior. That means they have to confront something that makes them uncomfortable. And a lot of people I find are not ready to do that. They're not ready to face that, which means that they will face it when it's too late. And that makes it even worse, but no, that's the human condition. But there are people who are more open-minded, and I meet them online and at Bitcoin conferences, and even I was invited to a climate technology conference in Malmo, Sweden. That was really cool. That was really exciting because that was the first time I spoke at a conference That wasn't a Bitcoin conference, but the people who invited me, they had been paying attention to the stuff we had been talking about in Bitcoin for the past year about renewable energy and the electrical grid and things like that, and Bitcoin mining. And so that was really exciting. If you can get on stage and talk to some people who are open at least to technology, they might be more open to Bitcoin's potential. Mm. So yeah, but in my personal life, I don't really talk too much about it. So I don't really have really good advice on that.
Well, I think though, doing these kinds of interviews, and you've done a few and writing your essays, I mean, that's sharing the information and to the people who are looking, which are the ones who are going to gravitate towards it.
Yeah, those are the people to focus on. I would like to write a book soon that would be more for those people that are looking, looking for answers, because those people are out there and they haven't yet really heard this particular perspective on Bitcoin or on sustainability, the climate, energy. So I would love to write a book about that to reach those people, to get them interested, because we do need more people like that in the Bitcoin space as well. And I think there's a lot of people who they're concerned, but they don't really know what to do. And most of the information out there just makes you feel like, well, there's nothing I can do. This is hopeless. It's very easy in the climate movement. We have this term called doomer, or like doomers or doomerism, and that these are people who basically they look at the data, the science, they think, okay, well, there's nothing we can do. This is just going to be terrible, and we're probably going to go extinct, and civilization is going to collapse, and all these terrible things are going to happen. So why bother? And that's a really it's a really terrible place to be, I think. A lot of people are in that position where they really have given up. You shouldn't give up without trying. You should at least try first. And there's a guy named Chris Hedges. Well, he's a well-known guy on the quote-unquote political left, and but he used to be a preacher. I think he went to seminary school, and this was probably why he has this perspective. But I always think of him whenever I think of basically giving up, which is, he says things like, we don't do this because we think we can win. We do it because it's the right thing to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind when we're dealing with really big societal problems like climate change, or like the economic system, or the way our countries work, is that we have to, even though it's really hard and we may not succeed, we shouldn't just give up and not try at all, because it's the right thing to do to try. And you want to be able to say that you tried, because there are future lives that are depending on the present people who are alive today to do something. So that's a really important thing to keep in mind, and that I try to keep in mind, because it is really challenging. When you're working on something this big, it is really hard. Sometimes you feel downtrodden. Sometimes you feel like giving up, or like, what is the point? Nobody will change. And I feel like that sometimes. And I think a lot of people who work on issues like this feel like that sometimes. But we have to keep trying and give yourself space and just don't give up. So
yeah. I would really like to ask you, Margot, some questions. You've been quite broad in talking about climate change and Bitcoin. And just for our audience who may not really understand the kind of the deeper concepts of even like proof of work or Bitcoin mining, it's just, I really want to land in just why perhaps you believe that Bitcoin is positive for climate change. I think there is so much out there that suggests that climate change is, yes, it's driven by, we can see it's driven by the monetary system, because of like capitalism and like production and deplete resources, essentially. That is quite a big aspect, and that might be your main aspect. But do you find that there's also benefits to just Bitcoin in terms of its mining that can support the climate change agenda? And what are those?
Yeah. So my initial thesis around Bitcoin and climate change was really much more of a social value thing than really Bitcoin mining originally. My whole idea was we have a system that doesn't work, a system that is broken. And if we stay in this system, which is creating all of these symptoms, right? We have a money that is that gets has inflation, and it's this, and there's a lot of debt, and there's this immense debt burden, and the financialization of the economic system has created a huge gap in wealth. The income inequality has increased in the last 40 years. And this system, because of this drive for eternal economic growth, every year you have to grow more than you did before. That means that you have to use more resources. So basically, it's like, well, this system, as it is designed, is causing these problems, and it's causing climate change. You can't really just decarbonize, that's not enough. That doesn't solve the root problem. People think that climate change is the root problem, but it's a symptom. It's a symptom of the root problem. So if we stay in this existing economic system, we are going to have other problems come up. It won't just be putting CO2 into the atmosphere. I mean, we already see that, right? We're constantly, I think as a society, we can get the sense that we're sitting on the edge of a cliff, teetering back and forth, unsure of when we're going to fall off because of the instabilities that exist in the economic system. And there's a lot of you see signs of them in various markets, especially around debt, collateral, and with the interest rates. I'm not an expert on that, but I see what's going on, and it to me makes sense that that's a problem. So I feel that if we want to have something better, then we have to exit the existing system. So in order to do that, we need a way out, right? And I think a lot of people get that sense, even just thinking about climate change. Okay, because in the climate movement, people say system change, not climate change. Okay, so yes, we know we need system change, and we have ideas of what the new system could look like, right? But then how do we get from point A to point B? So if you think about it in terms of, okay, well, the economic system is how we basically arrange our social relations, then we need something on the economic sense that can do that. And at the time, I had not really read ecological economics. So this was much more of an intuitive understanding, when it was really more like, well, look, we have this alternative monetary system. It's called Bitcoin. It has it's been around since 2009, first introduced in 2008, and it's the only thing that exists that has any chance of succeeding, as far as I can tell, as a real monetary system. And it has these unique properties. It's got this monetary cap of 21 million Bitcoin, which means that you can't really devalue it. Nobody owns the network. It belongs to anyone who wants to participate in the network. So that means centralizing control and manipulating it would be very difficult. So that's a really important property. It also is censorship resistant. It's confiscation resistant, which means if you educate yourself on best practices, it's really hard for anybody to take it from you, especially governments, which is a big concern, especially given the economic and social instabilities that we are facing and will likely continue to face as climate change gets worse and as the economic system worsens. So these are really important properties that to me say, okay, well, this is something that we could use. We could take all of our money, the value that we store in basically fiat currencies, and put it into Bitcoin. And one of my inspirations for that was actually came from a paper that I read, and I was reading about resilience pathways, and it was really, so it was basically like with climate change, right? Climate change is going to affect these ecosystems, right? And people are involved, and in water resources, you have to manage the relationship between the various stakeholders that use that water, right? If you have a river, it's not just it's not just animals are drinking the water, right? You need that water for irrigation, you need that water to pipe into homes, and you need the water to maintain the natural resources and the animals that use it, right? So there's a lot of stakeholders involved with these big watersheds. So I was studying the Murray-Darey Basin in Australia at the time. I came across this paper by Abel et al. About these resilient pathways and how there's these moments of conservation, and then there's these moments of transformation, and a resilient pathway for a system can then allow you to adapt to shocks to the system. So whether it's a bioshock or an ecological shock or an economic shock, right? And there's these moments of conservation where people don't want to change, and then there's this opening that happens that allows for that transformation to occur. So that was this Abel paper, and then they wrote a second paper. They wrote a paper about socioeconomic collapse, and they looked at examples of, and of course the dogs are all barking right now. That's so sad. About socioeconomic collapse, and they looked at different systems where people had experienced this. And when people, we tend to think like socioeconomic collapse, oh, that sounds bad, like like everything ends, oh, it's chaos, it's like apocalypse, end of times. But it's not really like that. And they look at basically like the collapse of the agrarian society in the United States. They looked at this collapse, this livestock region economy in Zimbabwe. They looked at another one in Australia, I think, with Aboriginal people. And the thing that they said was the way to deal with an economic collapse or socioeconomic collapse is to take all forms of capital out of that system and move it into a new system. And so that's sort of what happened in these scenarios where people basically stopped doing one thing and then shifted their society into a different kind of society. I forget exactly the details, but the point is like, if you want to survive an socioeconomic collapse, you need to move into a new system. So you need to take all forms of capital, human capital, like, monetary capital, whatever, all things of value, and transfer it. So that was the inspiration for that idea with Bitcoin and climate change. It's like, okay, we have the economic system doesn't work. Financialization has been a problem, and it's not just financialization in the general sense that we're used, but now it's also financialization of nature, and also this drive for economic growth. And central banks have also, through quantitative easing, they've put a lot of money into fossil fuels and not so much into green technology, quote unquote green technology, right? So there has been what a lot of people, a common term or phrase used a lot in Bitcoin, which is malinvestment, right? So there's been all this malinvestment going on, and central banks have played a certain role in that. as you know. So it's like, okay, and also just in general, because there's this really incestuous relationship between the central banks and the private banking system. And if you recall 2008, the financial crisis and all of that happened there, in the United States in particular, it was really problematic because what people saw, everyday Main Street people saw, was that these big banks were set, they told us they were too big to fail, they were safe, but people were not too big to fail, apparently. So they were left behind. And I was part of Occupy Wall Street, the Occupy movement. So I remember at the time that we were basically boycotting the big banks by moving our money into credit unions. And I did that, actually. I did that during that time. And I kept my money in a credit union for a very, very long time after that. And I thought, because it, was the right thing to do, was the ethical thing to do. How, you can go out on the street and protest with a sign, but that's not going to change them. But if you take the money out of that system and you say, nope, sorry, you can't use that, you can't use this, then that says something, sends a message. So the combination of those two ideas, this socioeconomic collapse, resilient pathways stuff that I had read in academic papers, combined with my experience in the Occupy movement, made me realize that Bitcoin could be a vehicle for system change in terms of climate change, because we're always saying system change, not climate change. And if we want to get out of system A, which we can define as having clear signs of socioeconomic collapse, then we need a way to get to system B, which is the one that everybody wants, which has all the possibilities, can have adaptive pathways, can be more resilient. But first, we have to start by moving all of our literal capital out, and creating a new monetary system. So Bitcoin to me just seemed like a very obvious tool for that. So that was my original view on Bitcoin. It was really not anything to do with the energy side at the time. It was purely a socio-economic perspective on climate change, which is why I called my essay a financial Hail Mary for the climate, an argument for Bitcoin, something like that. So, because it was really just like, oh, I see that there's all of these things that are wrong. Why don't we use Bitcoin to our favor to try to change the system by actually, putting pressure, by taking out, exiting the economic system, creating new economies, like these circular economies that we're seeing popping up, and especially in the global south, a system that exists outside of the existing failing system. So that was my first big picture view on Bitcoin and climate change, and it's still the one that I think is the most important one. Then later on, I started getting more into the Bitcoin mining side, really trying to understand that more and the potential benefits of it, especially around the electrical grid, and also off-grid wasted energy stuff. Because one of the big questions around Bitcoin mining energy use is there a limit to that energy use, and is it really going to move away from fossil fuels? And in what way would it do that? And if it does use fossil fuels, what percentage of it will that be in the long term? And what are the pressures to shift Bitcoin mining in a different direction that is not putting CO2 into the atmosphere? So that isn't monetizing more CO2 into the atmosphere. So then that's when I started to get more into that, to try to answer those questions. And those questions I'm still working on, but I have a better sense now of what's going on, and the direction that I think it's going. I think it just makes sense, just based off of how the network works. But that's the overview of my takes on Bitcoin mining and the environment, and what just the areas that really interest me.
Thank you for sharing that,
So,
Mark. Yeah, it was
yeah, it was a lot.
I think it's helpful for the audience to kind of hear a slightly different take on the link between Bitcoin and the environment is probably where I would say that would be, because when you were talking about systems change, I think it's not just climate change, but it's all systems, with like water, it's resource depletion. And so, I think with the climate change piece, that is so reliant on the energy piece, because we think about the use of energy or fossil fuels as like the thing that fuels Bitcoin, kind of contributes to climate change. So it's interesting to kind of see how, I think we've talked about how that can, how it can incentivize cleaner ways of creating energy for Bitcoin miners, and can help to steer our energy into cleaner directions, because it's ultimately where the money is being made. With Bitcoin, it's like we want to keep mining Bitcoin. So if we want to do this sustainably, we need to invest in those more sustainable ways of producing energy. So I think we've kind of talked about that piece around the sort of the direct contribution of Bitcoin to perhaps climate change, and how it's actually, they're making efforts to try to deviate that, or find energy from more renewable sources. So it is really interesting to bring in this other side of how Bitcoin as a new financial system can support a recreation of our system that deviates away from excessive overproduction, which is produced often by, oversupply of money to banks that goes to big businesses, that then heightens the kind of resource depletion.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, it's all money. Most of the money that is in our economic system is created through credit creation, which is basically I make a loan and then I put money into the system. I pay back the loan that destroys that money. That's the basic idea. So, the more loans you make, right, the more money you have in the system, and there's no real check on that money creation. So also the way that our money works is it incentivizes the present over the future. So we're incentivized to spend now, and that's that like the inflation that we have, the inflation targeting of 2% every year. I mean, ask the Federal Reserve, why do you do inflation targeting? Why target 2%? It's an arbitrary number for one thing, but the reality is that this inflation targeting is designed to make you spend, so that the money is moving through the economic system, fast, and nobody is, you're not incentivized to save your money. You're not incentivized to hold on to it and plan for a future purchase, over a present purchase. So you're going to spend your money on cheap products. You're going to not hold back. And so ecological economics, they've identified this as a fundamental cause of not investing in sustaining our resources, right? And not thinking in the long term of resource use and protecting these resources for future generations. And there's a guy, I have his book. Hang on. I want to get his name right here. His name is John Peet. So he's an ecological economist, and I like what he wrote about this time preference problem, which is really interesting, because in Austrian economics, they also talk about time preference, short time preference. I mean, in ecological economics, they talk about it too. And basically, it's like, look, the money system, I found it, the time value of money. Then he says the concept of the time value of money is quite separate from the general effects of inflation. But then social time preference reflects the idea that most private decisions are believed to neglect the need to take account of future generations. In other words, individuals are seen as always acting in such a way to maximize their current personal utility. So, it's like, if you can switch that incentive so that you're not incentivized to spend because your money is going to be worth less in the future, then you might actually value the future more over than you do now. I mean, we all have present needs, like we have to eat, we need to be clothed, we need a roof over our head. So there are things that you are going to spend on. But if your money isn't valued over the future time, if you know that your money is going to be worth something in the future, you may be less incentivized to want to just spend it now. And so the point is that if you want to preserve the planet for future generations, you need the right economic incentives to not just constantly create, consumer products for the present and just use up all of the resources for the present to spend all of that money now. So that's a fundamental problem in the economic system. And Bitcoin is, because of this 21 million cap, the incentives are flipped. So you have this, it changes the way you think, right? You think, okay, I don't really want to spend all of my Bitcoin now because I want to save it for the future because it's going to be worth more in the future. I mean, it's built in. Right? There's a certain amount of scarcity that's built into it that makes that appealing. So my feeling is that on the fundamental level, if you can change the underlying money incentives, that's a really good foundation to build something new, a different kind of society. On top of that hopefully reduces that excess consumption and gets people to value the future a little bit more over the present.
I just had one last little question on that part, was just like hearing about Bitcoin and that there's a sense that there's a stability coming, or that there is a continual growing of value over time because of the fact that there's only 21 million, and if everyone adopted it, it would obviously grow in value because more people would be wanting it. But obviously at the moment, with these huge fluctuations, so you can see the kind of price of Bitcoin fluctuating wildly, like when do you have any sense of that longevity? Like at what point do you think that there will become more of a stability, and then from there we just continue to grow? And is that what we're really waiting for? Yeah,
it's really challenging because my thesis is we should exit the system, right? Let's take all of our value out and put it into something in a different monetary system. But the short-term volatility is challenging. I mean, it's challenging for myself, and I'm advocating for this, right? I am not like, I do have a bank account still, and I'm still figuring out the best way to do this, to implement this, and buying Bitcoin and using it because I do use it, but you have to. It is a little bit of a challenge, especially right now, because of the speculation in Bitcoin and the institutions that can speculate like that. They treat Bitcoin as a high risk investment. So any sign of problems, economic problems, they go risk off and they sell all their Bitcoin, and then price goes down. So you have to find ways to hedge against that. And there are things coming like stable sats, but stable sats are limited really, I think, to people in the global south because they use a type of future contract basically, or two sets of future contracts that make it so that you basically stabilize your Bitcoin price. Let's say right now my Bitcoin is let's say I own one Bitcoin for simplicity. It's worth $16,000 today. I put it in a wallet that creates these special contracts for me, and I say, okay, it's gonna sit there for a month, and when I'm ready to use it, it will still be worth 16,000 regardless of what the selling price is right then. So it could be that in a month Bitcoin is worth 18,000, or it could be that it's worth 10,000. But when I'm ready to use that Bitcoin, it will still be 16,000. So that's sort of a way to hedge that volatility, but we're not, like in the US, we can't do that. We're not allowed to engage in those contracts legally. So that's a little bit of a challenge with the volatility. But I think that over time that volatility will reduce because there will be a point, I think, when there's not going to be, I think, well, so I think that it's possible if mass adoption happens and Bitcoin is used everywhere, that that volatility will decrease. And I heard Lawrence White, he's an economist, talking about this once in an interview. And the guy kind of pushed him about it. He's like, which was the same question, like, this volatility kind of turns people off. And it's sort of like but the adoption will reduce the volatility, but the volatility, it reduces adoption, right? So it's this weird dynamic where you have to get over this hump. And it's sort of like it's almost like an energy barrier, like in physics and quantum mechanics, we talk about this, like you have a particle, right? This is really, really maybe not a good analogy for anyone who's in physics, but you have a particle and it's like between two walls, and these are energy barriers, and there's that in order for that particle to escape, it has to have enough energy to get over that barrier, right? So it's the same kind of idea. It's like Bitcoin adoption has this energy barrier, which is the volatility, and it needs just enough energy to be able to get over that, to then have that adoption. But in a way, it's okay because there's still a lot of development happening that needs to happen in Bitcoin, and I don't think rushing adoption is a wise thing. I think the problem is that we have, like we said earlier, there's a lot of instabilities in the existing economic system, and Bitcoin is a lifeboat in that sense. So, on the other hand, like, well, it'd be great, a lot of people need Bitcoin now, but I think the volatility is sort of beneficial right now in the sense that it gives the people who are developing the tools time to continue developing them for that moment, to be ready for that time when a lot more people will need Bitcoin. And there's a high probability that a time like that will come. So in the meantime, we just have to keep, thinking about accepting some of that volatility, some of that risk, and letting people know that there is this volatility. You have to find ways to deal with it and slowly ease into it, and then see where things go from there. But yeah, it is a little bit of a struggle, but I think it's important. I think that volatility is important too, because in the existing economic system, central banks, they target price stability. That's really important. The price has to always be, within a certain range. And I think it's really interesting to have a monetary system where because of the monetary cap, the 21 million Bitcoin, that you have this inelasticity, this sensitivity to demand, to supply and demand in the market and the exchange. So it kind of it reflects the reality, but I think it's kind of interesting. But at any rate, I think in the long term, as mass adoption happens, if mass adoption happens, that the volatility will lessen. I think that will ultimately be the way that it does. So,
well, and and I think it's also has to do with place. I just keep thinking about what's happening in Africa. Let's say that I think the younger generation, I don't know the statistics anymore, the numbers, people under the age of 30, like 1 in 5 or so people were using Bitcoin,
yeah.
or some kind of cryptocurrency. I actually am not sure 100% it was all Bitcoin, but there is, that's a significant adoption rate in Africa. And then you look at El Salvador, and the adoption there. So it's interesting, you've got this time scale, but then you also have sort of this space scale because it's being adopted a lot more in other places. But again, like having it adopted in the United States, having the US dollar and being sort of the main economic driver globally, the buck stops with the USA.
Yeah.
Again, that might change though. We don't know, a lot of, I think China and Russia and Iran have stopped using the dollar as their sort of the go-to fiat for their exchange. So yeah, I wanted to just look at the positive a little bit, about it will take time, but we've also got these like little gems of places that are going through this adoption, serious adoption. So
yeah, it's really cool. Especially, I think this is a really interesting kind of game theory for Bitcoin that I like a lot, because these are where the Bitcoin adoption is highest, is in places where they have had the most exploitation, economic exploitation, right? The West has done a very good job of suppressing development of certain countries in the global South and the African continent, especially, and all of that is basically colonial extractivism. We had this whole period of the Europe and the US being very imperialist and going into these parts of the world and basically creating these terrible deals. And even today the US still engages in these horrible deals on the African continent to extract the resources. There was just recently something, I saw a video, I don't know. I don't want to spread misinformation or anything, but it seemed like the US was engaging in some deal making around some minerals that are important for batteries, and they were doing it in a particular one African country, and it didn't sound like they were making a deal that was beneficial to those people in this country. It was more beneficial to US corporations. So I think that this stuff still goes on today, but in these places, the adoption of Bitcoin is much higher. There's the experiments with circular economies are all in the global South, the Philippines, South Africa, El Salvador, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Nigeria, Brazil. All of these places, this is happening. And it's because these are also places that have they have really bad currencies. People have experienced having their savings, literally their bank accounts confiscated from them. They've lived under dollar hegemony, dollarization of their country, having your debt and it not denominated in your own country's currency is a form of economic slavery, in my opinion. So, that is hopeful. Yeah, that is really hopeful. And I think it's great because it's basically like a wealth transfer, if you think about it, because if they get Bitcoin before the West gets Bitcoin, and we assume that the value of Bitcoin will increase over time, as we think it will, then they will benefit the most as a society from that, because they will already know how to use Bitcoin. They will already hide Bitcoin, and their wealth will grow as a people, as a society, as a region of the world. And they'll hopefully be much better off, and maybe it'll just be a more level playing field because the West will be behind on adoption. I mean, and I think it's also very interesting game theory that it's the West that is talking about banning Bitcoin, not these countries, like not Singapore, not El Salvador, not any of these countries in the South and in the global South. So I think, I don't think that's a coincidence either, because I think Bitcoin really is, even though they don't want to admit it, Bitcoin is a threat to the dollar and the euro, because you can't control it. So the response to that is the CBDC, central bank digital currency, which they can control, and they're doing it because I think that they feel threatened by Bitcoin and what it represents. I can be my own bank, or my community. We can be our own bank. You can't really stop people from doing that. How do you know that they're running, a node, a Bitcoin node? How do you know that they're running they have their own Chaumian, oh, I'm having trouble saying that, an eCash setup, right? Chaumian eCash. How do you know that they're running that on their node, and that they're sharing their Bitcoin, like custodying their Bitcoin together? You don't know that. It's hard to know that because it's all on a computer, unless you break into the house and you look for their node. I guess it could come to that, but it's not easy to stop people from doing that, is my point. It's just like Tor, or like downloading videos through torrents. You can't, it's not possible to stop every instance of that happening because it's decentralized. So that's a decentralized money system like that is a really powerful threat to a centralized monetary system that is built on controlling every aspect of that economic system. So that's this like really cool game theory. And so sometimes I think, maybe we shouldn't fight. Maybe we shouldn't fight the Western powers who want to ban Bitcoin. Maybe we should just let them, because that will benefit these other people. And we're so rich here in the West that them getting even a little bit of a level playing field is going to be fine. It's not really going to hurt us. At least I don't think. So in some ways, I kind of think like, why even try? Why stop it? Let it happen. And then it's like, Jeff Booth kind of talks about this like location arbitrage type thing. Like, people will just move. People who really care about Bitcoin and believe in the philosophy and all the stuff that we've talked about, they'll just move to where Bitcoin is accepted and where all of these new things are happening and all of this potential. They'll just go there. And I think that's really okay. So, and I think that, and one last thing is, a lot of people, they think that Bitcoin is a right-wing project, but it's not. It's not a right-wing project. Just the thing is that the Austrian economists identified the importance of decentralized money before anybody else did. And I think part of that is because people on the left they're the root fundamental basis of the Leftern philosophy, political philosophy, is in Marx's writings on capitalism. Marx disagreed with Proudhon, who was an anarchist at the time, that changing the monetary system was really important. Marx disagreed with that, but I think Marx was wrong. I think Proudhon was right, and that's okay. But people really take Marx sometimes sort of like, a biblical figure in a way, and I think that really has derailed certain aspects of the left's ability to have a broader philosophical economic understanding of the economic system, and I think that there are things that are correct when they talk about money as debt, but then they miss that there are some things that the Austrian economists pointed out that are also correct. And Mark Fisher wrote a book called Capitalist Realism, and it's this sense that we are stuck in an existing system and we don't know how to get out of it, and somehow we became stuck. And how did we get stuck, and how do we get unstuck, right? And so Bitcoin is one of those ways, and that's why I said, like, people can do this location arbitrage, which, arbitrage is such like a very like economic term, markets term, but really it's like, I can choose where I want to live. That's basically all it's saying. I can find a better place to live. I can bet on this place where they're going to adopt Bitcoin, where they're going to create a whole new economic system, or they're creating these local circular Bitcoin economies, and they're using Bitcoin mining to incentivize the build out of new energy systems that didn't even exist, because Westerners with all the money, they don't want to invest it because they see it as a risk, right? There's all this grassroots stuff that's happening, and yes, there's companies involved in it, but there's lots of people that are just doing it on their own. And I think that's that element of being able to just recreate or reorganize, rearrange your social relations, your society, and having the incentive to do it with a fundamental shift in the monetary system, and to shift in those incentives that we've talked about, right? I think that is very much aligned with what Graeber and Wengrow identified in the dawn of everything, which is really really comes out of the left, the left philosophy or the left viewpoint. Anarchism is really an anti-capitalist, anti-hierarchy, anti-oppression perspective, socio-relation perspective philosophy on how to arrange your society, how you interact with people. So I think that people are missing that actually, if you really dig deeper, this is it's not a right-wing thing. It's not really even a left-wing thing. It's really just a way in which people have always been. It's just a way to be able to choose how to live your life, how to rearrange your relations, how you interact with people, and having the freedom to do that. And we need to find a way out to do that. And for me, I think that this is a really good step in the right direction. We can't escape money now. Maybe someday there will be societies that don't need money, but I think that this is a really good first step. And I do think that we need to allow for more diversity in the way that we interact with each other, and to have that freedom to do that, because through the history of humanity, we have always had that ability. Whether we create societies that are really harsh and very hierarchical with kings, or we have societies that are more hunter-gatherer type societies, or we have more agrarian, but we have very low inequality, more type society, whatever, right? We have the ability to choose. It should be as much as our imagination lets us decide. And we should be able to seek out the people who we want to create those societies with. And then the next step for me is, well, yes, but also how do we maintain all of the technological advances that we have, make it so that it's sustainable, and also have these freedoms. And I think that the internet, even though there are a lot of problems in terms of centralization of control, there's still it's the ability to re-decentralize the internet is still possible. And the combination of Bitcoin, I think, is a really important missing piece in all of that. So yeah, so I think these are all of this is to say, yeah, it's like really exciting what's going on.
Yeah, thank you
There's
so
so many
much for sharing
possibilities.
all these ideas and possibilities. And we'd love to talk more in the future and
Yeah,
dive
sure.
into some more. There's so many directions and so many intricacies, and it's so exciting. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me and letting me rant and perseverate.
I love your rants. I totally love your rants.
No, we love having you on. Anya and I definitely have some rants ourselves, so it's really lovely just to hear the passion and to have this kind of beautiful joy about Bitcoin and our want to share it, and our individual passions and how they feed into our view of Bitcoin and what we hope for the world. And it's really exciting that there's so much alignment in one technology that can harness the sides, that there is no side left or right. It harnesses all sides. It's a human right. And so that's really a really beautiful, powerful thing to be left with. So thank you so much, Margot, for joining us today. And we look forward to speaking to you again soon.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Yeah, definitely.